So for our fourth speaker, we'd like to welcome Hilary Gallo. So Hilary was a recommendation from our founder, Malcolm Stern, and Hilary is a lawyer, a coach and a negotiation expert, and he leads retreats for executives who are wanting to look at their life and working in a different way. He's the author of The Power of Soft, which is available tonight, and it's about how to get what you need and still be nice. So please welcome the very nice Hilary Gallo.
Good evening, everyone. I thought I'd start with a little bit of a confession. I kind of thought this would be the best place, or a good place, to do it. You see, I didn't start. I've written a book called The Power of Soft, but I started my career in anything but a soft place. I actually, as has been mentioned, I started my career as a lawyer in a big city law firm. And these are the sort of places where you're taught, I was taught, to prize logic above everything else. So I grew up in the start of my career caring about logic, about persuasive argument, about hard facts. I was trained to be an expert. And that's what I was tooled in. My crunch point came. I moved out of the law firm in the city and I worked in business. And I got much closer to the real issues that were going on in the organisation. And I was working on a deal. I was leading a negotiation up in the West Midlands with a big industrial conglomerate. And we were locked in these negotiations for weeks on end. And as a deal team, we got a bit aggressive. I don't know if many of you have been in that sort of situation where you can start to believe your own story. We kind of believed what we thought about our own position, our own logic, our own dynamics. And we prized that above anything else. And we got into the most terrible discussions with our customer, somebody who was meant to be our potential client. And it got more and more antagonistic. But I didn't really realise that, because we were going back in the evenings to a big hotel and pumping ourselves up as a team. It was only when I went home on a Saturday evening, I went home to my partner at the time, who was a very wise and smart woman. And I walked through the door and I got on with the evening, but she started to call me out. She observed first that my behaviour had got strange. She remarked on the language I was using. I was swearing a lot. I was being quite abusive. And I think, to be honest, she was probably a little bit scared. And that started to concern me. And I kind of knew, it started to sink upon me that something was very wrong. And we've heard earlier this evening about this idea that in life you can only walk so far away from who you really are. And I think in hindsight, I'd kind of done that. The country boy who'd come to London and learnt this logic and the power of argument, learnt how to be a good lawyer, had stretched himself just too far, and it just wasn't me. So I embarked on this journey back from this hard position where I'd started to live my life and my career, back, and I started to explore a more spiritual, softer side of doing things. And I played around with this for some years. The problem with that is I eventually got to the point where I didn't really understand or like the hardness that I had been guilty of myself. As I moved away from it, I could see it in more relief. And I looked back at it, and I didn't like it. And I had a conversation with a colleague he was a coach, and he asked me a really good question, because I expressed this concern about what I didn't like and what I wanted to do about it. And I think sometimes we've heard about the pizzeria question. Sometimes people like that physical thing. You feel something internally, but naming something externally makes it easier. And to this question, I found a very simple answer about what I didn't like, about the behaviour that I was still seeing in the world and which I too had been guilty. And that answer was very simply Punch and Judy. I hope many of you, most of you, have heard of the puppet show Punch and Judy. Yes? For anyone who doesn't know it, it's basically a succession of shows where Punch, who sits on the Punch professor's right hand, funnily enough, gets to beat up his wife, Judy, and a succession of characters, one after another. And it's a really weird show because it's quite aggressive and abusive, and yet you see parents at the seaside pushing their children forward to go and watch. And you'd think to watch a show of domestic abuse would be a bit odd, but somehow it works and people love it. And this is, when I looked at Punch and Judy, I realised that that's part of the spell here. This, like many things in this wonderful country of ours, is an import. It came from Italy about 350 years ago, and it absorbed, once it arrived here, it absorbed the culture of the country that it was being played in. And it did that because nobody wrote the script for Punch and Judy. It's got a script that develops on the street. So what gets laughs, what gets a response, gets put in the show, it carries on. What doesn't get much of a laugh, doesn't get much response, finds its way out. So it's an improvised performance, and as such it mirrors the society in which it grows up. So it's an interesting reflection for all of us on this period of our history, which has essentially been the period of British Empire and the growth of British Empire. And essentially, out of that, in this analysis, I was searching for what was the root of this hard behaviour. I learnt two things that were crucial to me, and both of which I reflected on and saw in my own life as a negotiator of deals. The first is the Punch is incredibly positional. Punch doesn't just have a belief about something. He takes that belief and he turns it into a definite, clear position about what ought to happen about that thing. He's the sort of chap that if he was going down his favourite pub and somebody took his seat and they happened to be from a foreign country, he would be anti-immigration. He wouldn't think that what he cared about was a bit more space at the pub or the fact that he'd missed the opportunity for a chat. He wouldn't question any of that. He'd just take a simple position about it. He's incredibly closed and inflexible and positional. He doesn't ever get to question what he really needs, what really is cutting at his heart, and what really the matter is with the situation. And that's a bit of a sadness. But that's what happens. And I realise that's something very much present in this hard way of thinking as compared to a softer, more flexible way of thinking. The second thing about Punch, and probably the biggest thing, is that he's a dominant power player. And this is something that grew up through the fact that it represented the street show. At that time, if you were a man, you stood the risk of being impressed into the navy. There was violence on the streets, significantly more violence than we're used to nowadays. So the culture that's grown up through that period of the growth of the British Empire is one of dominant power. If people wanted to get something done, they would exercise power over you. And then at its worst, that would take the form of slavery, and its kindest, it would take the form of coercion by money. But it's a way of getting what one wants by pushing hard and forcing someone in a certain direction. It's very different from trying to encourage someone. But the biggest thing I realised about Punch is that he's ruled by fear. We've heard a bit about fear earlier this evening and its importance in our lives. But I realised through this that what was really driving Punch and what was beneath all this was actually he's rather scared. And I saw that as a reflection in some of my own behaviour, and I increasingly saw it in the behaviour of my colleagues back at the ranch who are insisting on these harder behaviours. That actually beneath that braveness there's a real fear. And I was really interested. I saw a lot of shows in London during Punch's 350th anniversary a few years back. And one of the puppeteers who came from Naples, Bruno Leone, showed one of the original shows that Punch was based on, and he introduced his puppets. And the Punch figure, what Punch had come from, is named Pulcinella in Naples. And Bruno explained that actually means little chicken. So when you think of Punch, which can now be represented by, David Cameron famously said that he'd get rid of Punch and Judy politics when he was elected in 2005 to Conservative Party leader. Didn't he do well, by the way? He famously said he'd get rid of Punch and Judy, but I think today we see more Punch and Judy figures around us than ever who are guilty of that dominant behaviour and that positional playing. So that leaves me with one thing, which is to mediate the difference between this hardness that I talked about in the beginning and the softness that I was exploring. I didn't really explain that. And to be frank, I struggled with that myself for many, many, many years. What is the balance between those two, and how do you get that right? And I was very fortunate. I was offered a new role, a new job, some years back now. And I went into this new organisation. I went in as a commercial director to run a team and to help turn the business around, to make it more profitable. And one of the briefs was to get more business, to win more deals, to have happier clients, and to make the business more profitable. And as part of that exercise, I went out and I talked to the sales teams and I talked to the customers about the problems. I wanted to find out what was going on. And the feedback I got was that everyone found this organisation incredibly tough to do business with. They found it very aggressive. They said that our first knowledge about your organisation is that it's some people use the word spiky. And it reminded me of this Punch character. Because what they said was that we don't know what to expect from your organisation. You're just actually not very easy to do business with. And I started to draw this, when I explained it to people, as a very spiky, it was like hedgehog shape. And it was a very frontal shape. So at its front, the way it went into the world, it was very sharp. The odd contrast with that, though, was that when you pushed away at the organisation, customers would say to me, "We get confused," because there was nothing actually behind it. Behind this very aggressive front and this tough demeanour, this aggressive behaviour, if the customer asked, "Well, I'm not happy with what you've said. I'm sending back your contract because it's too difficult." If the customer pushed away, what the organisation would do is just say, "Well, what would you like then? How would you like this set up? What sort of terms would you like to do business on?" When you pushed away at this organisation, it had no core. There was nothing behind this hardness at front. So it had this very aggressive face, but a very soft and squidgy centre. It didn't know what it needed, a bit like Punch. And it, even better, had no idea of its own power. It wanted to exercise dominant power, but it had no sense of the power it could actually exercise. And out of this, I kind of realised that the model should be the other way around. And that is what the power of soft is built on. It's built on a completely different arrangement of that. It's built on what I call a strong core. It's a bit like, if you think about it, when you do Pilates, you strengthen the core of the body. You give yourself a strong back and a strong core of muscles. And you find if you do that, that the outside part of the body takes care of itself. If you have a strong core, you can be softer. And this is kind of how the model for me works. We have a strong core, which is much more understanding of what it needs. Not only it, but its customers, or its relationship with the world. It also understands where power really comes from. And power is not something that other people can exercise over us. Power is something we hold to ourselves. Power is something we all have innately through the very act of living. And what we choose to do far too much is give that power up to big organisations, big structures. And that's one of the travesties of the way we tend to live, that we don't realise how much power we've got. Once you've built that strong core, you can afford to be much softer in your relationship with the world, and it can make you much more flexible and open. A client of mine once described it to me beautifully as like having a backpack when he went into a meeting. He said that I've essentially got all my understanding what I need and where my power lies, all the things that I must look after in this solid backpack, and it frees up my hands to be able to be in the room, to be able to listen to what I'm hearing, and to accommodate and take that, knowing that I've got some clear understanding of the principles that are behind what I need. And my model is as simple as that, ladies and gentlemen. So I give you the power of soft. Thank you.